we start our first panel discussion on innovation and what innovation means in the mind of world-class innovators, inventors, and professors from the finest institution in the United States and in the world. There is no shortage of challenges in today's world. And our hope throughout this event is to create an environment and platform for thinking. Throughout all the panels, we have individual talks where panelists come to the podium and they will give an 8-minute talk. When all panelists are done with their individual talks, we are going to ask them to come to the stage again for a panel discussion and kind of show off of the kind of gray matter we have assembled for you today. So we start with the first panelist for panel 1. Professor Hamid Jafarkhani, Fellow of American Association for the Advancement of Science and one of the top 10 most cited researchers in computer science. Professor Hamid Jafarkhani.
Okay. So since I'm the first panelist, I thought that I will just go through some basics and hopefully others will build on top of that. So first, let's start with science. So science is about discovering the behavior of the nature through observation and experiment. Scientific theory has to be falsifiable, which means we have to be able to test it and prove it wrong. So scientists will develop these experiments to test their theories. If a theory is validated through these experiments and everything works out, we will have this scientific paradigm that scientists believe in. So once in a while something else happens, we have a new experiment and that shows it does not match with the theory, and then we have to develop new theories. So that's what is called the paradigm shift in science. So then how about engineering? Well, engineering is not about this process of discovery, although it uses science, but it's mostly about creating new things. Well, the topic of discussion here is innovation, which has to do with creativity. So we want to see what are the kind of basic elements behind creativity and innovation. And if I want to do that, I think a simple definition for creativity is the ability to imagine or invent something new. But I also think that it's about the attitude and the process. So what do I mean by that? So there are these 3 elements that I have to kind of describe a little bit to perhaps make a point. So let's start with the first one. So the basic requirements or the ability. So everybody who has been innovative can tell you that you need to have experience and training, and also you need to have high IQ. I mean, an IQ of 100 probably is not good enough. But those 2 are probably not what makes an innovator, because there are so many people, talented people and high IQ people who may not be as innovative as they want to be. So the question is, what is the drive and desire to find the answer? So how do we have the motivation, and are we curious enough to make it? So this ability part actually is what most people probably talk about in engineering. But if I want to talk about the other two aspects that I want to emphasize, the attitude, and first let's start with attitude. So what are the characteristics of a creative person? Well, I talked about the fact that the person has to be curious. So the person needs to seek problems and enjoy challenges. You have to be optimistic because most of the time things don't work. You can't give up. Obviously, you have to be comfortable with imagination. You have to see problems as opportunities and interesting, not as obstacles. And you need to challenge the status quo. Otherwise, things, you have to think out of the box. But something that, at least for students, is important to know is that you should not give up easily. You have to work hard. So, but even if all those things, all those qualities you have the talent, you have the IQ, you have the attitude, then there is this process of innovation. So how does that process work? And that's the real question that hopefully today we will find out. I will find out by listening to other speakers. But I believe that it's kind of not out of blue. It's not that, this cartoonic version that we have in mind, that you see all of a sudden a lamp goes on top of your head. So there is a process that you can follow, and I think you can learn it and you can teach it. So that's something that hopefully we can talk about if we have some time later. So the good innovators, some of the people that I know from the panel are those who do it unconsciously. So they don't even think about how they innovated. If you ask them, okay, how did you do this excellent piece of work? They may not be able to explain to you exactly what are the steps that they went through. But I think this process can be taught, and there are steps that you can go cautiously through to kind of make it happen. So I will not have enough time to go through this. Maybe later we can discuss some of these things, but I have listed a few techniques that one can use in terms of the process of innovation. And then finally, I thought I just mentioned this quote from Albert Einstein, who said, it's not that I'm so smart. Of course, he was very smart, but it's just that I stay with problems longer. Okay, thank you very much.
The next distinguished speaker, Professor Mona Jarrahi, recipient of Presidential Early Career Award in 2013.
Thank you very much. I totally agree with the previous speaker that there is no formula for innovation. So I'll give my own version as an engineer. I look at innovation in the context of invention, solving problems. And that to me has three major facets. Most major innovations first come with defining the right problem. And that involves really what problem we are most passionate about solving, what kind of big difference we want to make in this world. Of course, we are not short of big problems to solve, but also knowing our capabilities, our qualities, help us to understand in what aspect we can make the most impact. After that, it is the real process of innovation. Again, there is no formula for that, but what I see as the most important part is to really clear our mind from all the conventional and traditional ways we know about a problem, the approaches, the solutions, and really with a fresh mind look at the problem, really think out of the box and not be afraid of failure and be ready to take big risks. Of course, most big innovations never came with the idea of what should we do to get rich. It is really the idea of making impact. After that, finally, as again mentioned by the previous speaker, is persistence and hard work and not giving up, because obviously solving big problems involves big challenges. So it's very important to be persistent. So it's hard for me not to talk about my own work now that I'm here. In my own research, I work on special type of sensors that work at terahertz frequencies. And this aspect of innovation is very important because we're trying to build hardware and gadgets in a part of spectrum that basically none of the gadgets that we had available before work. The frequency range I work on for my research is a portion, it covers a portion of the spectrum that is higher frequency than what we use in cell phones. So no transistors and electronic circuits work in this frequency range, but it's also lower frequency than optics, where most lasers and cameras work. So we have to constantly, literally we are not having that many tool sets to build these sensors. We have to constantly think out of the box and find alternative ways and approaches to solve problems and build these sensors, which have applications in a lot of imaging and chemical identification, medical diagnostics, and other applications. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Next speaker, Professor Babak Hassibi, recipient of Presidential Early Career Award in 2003. And just like a comment in parentheses, all the distinguished speakers have a very long bio, but for the sake of time, we only mention 1 sentence.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's certainly a privilege and honor to be here today, especially because I'm not a Sharif alum, so somehow I made it here. So anyway, I looked at the schedule as I was, trying to prepare something to speak about, and so there's, I guess, 3 panels, many speakers. So we will hear about, I assume, innovation every which way. And I think we already heard from the previous 2 speakers some interesting angles, and as was mentioned, I agree with a lot that was said. So I kind of thought that, maybe I should be a little innovative in terms of how I present innovation. And I kind of thought, and this will be a theme that I'll come back to, perhaps the most innovative thing I can do is to look at people who are more innovative than me and see what they have to say. So here's a quote. And this is a little bit of a gimmick that I learned in Iran, so I'm sure, we all grew up in Iran. We remember the clergy, the mullahs there. And so a gimmick that they had was whenever they wanted to say we're scholarly, educated, they would throw in an Arabic sentence. I was explicitly told to speak in English, and so I thought I'd throw a Latin sentence here. And so this says, mater artium necessitas. Can anyone tell me what that means? Yes, exactly. Necessity is the mother of invention. Actually, so Latin is like Persian. The verb comes at the end. So this is mother of invention is necessity, or necessity is. So it kind of sounds like Yoda from Star Wars. But so that's a statement, and we've heard that. My father used to say it a lot, Niyaz madare ikhtiras, I guess. We would say it a lot in Iran. I don't fully agree with it. I mean, there's partial truth to that. I think our, forefathers, foremothers, a lot of inventions they did was because they were trying to survive. They had necessities. But, I certainly don't think, the Wright brothers needed to fly, or that, Marconi needed to send a wireless signal across the Atlantic. As was mentioned, a lot of it is curiosity. It's human spirit that drives innovation. So I don't fully agree with this statement. But the other thing I want to point out is the middle word, artium, which is invention. But as you can see, the root word is art. So invention and innovative is, we're engineers, I guess, technical people mostly here. But it also relates to the art. In art, you also create things that did not exist before. And so the next quote I'm going to show you is actually from an artist, from Picasso. And he refers to art, but I think what he says refers to innovators more generally. So I'll let you read that. So good artists imitate, great artists steal. And as I said, I think this applies to innovation as well. And I'm not trying to be provocative. I'm not trying to be facetious. I think there's wisdom in this, and I'll talk to it in a moment. But before I do that, there's multiple examples. Google, you think of the biggest companies we have, and, I'm old enough, I remember all the search engines that came before Google, Alta Vista and whatnot. Facebook, we've all heard of Orkut. Steve Jobs and Apple is probably the quintessential innovator, and we all know the story of Steve Jobs visiting Xerox PARC and all the GUIs and avatars and everything that we associate with Apple were kind of stolen from Xerox PARC. So there is, I think, some truth to this, but, there's examples, but I think it's more than that, and I think Picasso, in fact, I should acknowledge there's other people who've said similar things. To really understand what this means, we have to understand what the difference between imitation and stealing is. And so what is the difference? So if you think about it, if you imitate, it's obvious that you're imitating, that you're copying. If you steal, it's not, right? It looks like your own. And so I think what is being said here is that if you're stealing an idea or a concept or knowledge, you should really internalize it, digest it, come up with your own narrative, make it your own. And if you make it your own, I think that's 50% of innovation already there. Because in doing so, you will have thought about it in a new way. If you're learning a new concept, say a mathematical fact, some scientific fact, if you think of how can I come up with this myself, how would I try to derive this result? If you do it on your own, kind of steal it and make it your own, I think that's 50% of what innovation is, and I think that's what Picasso is referring to here, and I think it's a key part in innovation. And again, if you think of the idea of stealing, in order to steal something, you need to know what people have. So you need to know what other people have done, how they've thought about problems. And that in itself, I think, is an important exercise. It's not as if we can go in a room and close the door and say, I'm an innovative person and I'll innovate on my own. You have to kind of be inspired and see what else is going on. So there's a lot more I can say. Time is short. And we heard a lot about other, aspects of innovation. There's one more I want to speak about. So I'll bring up Columbus here. I think we should celebrate Columbus. There is a Columbus Day in this country. Recently, I guess it's not fashionable to celebrate him. He created the genocide, supposedly, that happened here. Well, there was a genocide, I guess, of the Native Americans. But we can't really blame, I think, Columbus for that, right? He wasn't aspiring to come to this country and, create the extinguishing of the native people here. He wanted to discover a short route to India. And he failed, of course, because he did not find a short route to India. The person who did was this Portuguese explorer, Vasco da Gama, who went around Africa. He followed the African coast and then made his way to India. He's not well known, because, even though he did find the route to India. But Columbus is. And if you think of why that is, I think the reason why we should celebrate is not so much that he discovered America or didn't discover the road to India. It's that he had the courage to venture into the unknown. He took a westwardly route. So the Mediterranean seafaring nations, for perhaps 1,000 years could have gone west and never did. Or maybe they did and they went a few days and they didn't see anything, they chickened out and came back. So I think courage is important in innovation. You go west, you might discover a new continent, you might encounter sea monsters, I don't know. But you won't know until you do it. And so I think courage is also critical to innovation, venturing into the unknown. And then finally, just for some final thoughts, we're Persian, we like poetry, so I thought I would end with poetry. Again, I was told to do everything in English, so this is English poetry, and I don't really have a good feel for English poetry. But nonetheless, I choose 2 poems. Choose them based on 2 reasons. I wanted the poems to be short so they could fill in this slide, and so the 2 poems are short and they fill in the slide. There's another reason I chose them, and I don't know if you're reading through them. Is there anything particular about these poems that you think led me to choosing them? They may be weird, so let me give it away. So the first poem is by a famous early 20th century American poet, Ezra Pound. He, from what I've heard, is one of the poets who inspired, I think, Ahmed Shamlou. The second poem, on the other hand, is generated by a machine. So Ray Kurzweil wrote some software program, and if you inspire it, give it some words, it will generate a poem. And so this, I think, is really food for thought. We think of poetry and art, as I said, as creative and innovative. And so the question is, this is really a truly human endeavor? Or, is this a machine that's being created here? And again, this is not state of the art. This is a 5-year-old poem. So I don't know if now they churn out the equivalents of Shakespeare. I don't know. But as I said, it might frighten you, it might inspire you, but I think it's food for thought. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Next distinguished speaker, Professor Nasrin Rahimieh, Distinguished Professor of Humanity at UC Irvine.
Good morning. It's not necessary for me to point out that I'm completely misplaced among you engineers and innovators. But nonetheless, thank you for the organizers for making room for the humanities. So let me just answer the question of, I try to answer the question of what innovation means to me, and that necessitates for me to situate my work in the discipline of comparative literature, adabiyat tatbiqi, which doesn't exist in Iran any longer. And it was traditionally defined as the study of 2 or more national languages and literatures. In its origins, comparative literature, should I bring the mic down? Yeah, okay. I'm getting some signal. Is it better? A little more? Okay, thanks. Make a signal so I can do this. So in its origins, comparative literature really referred to and only included European languages and literatures. The inclusion of non-European traditions, such as Persian, is a much more recent phenomenon. And that came about as a result of critiques of Eurocentrism in the humanities and realignments of the concept of what really is world literature, a concept that has been around since the 18th, 19th century. Few Iranians, and I'm sure all of you, would dispute that the placement of Persian as world literature. But for the worldliness of Persian literature to become palpable, we need translations and adaptations that transport the works beyond the borders of our own language, time, and culture. Let me cite the example of the study of Hafiz. For instance, if you're a scholar and you want to study Hafiz, you would look for translations. The first English translation of Hafiz was the work of Sir William Jones in 1771. Jones was an erudite officer of the East India Company, so he was an agent of British colonization. And he had such an interest in languages that actually he studied linguistics and languages, and we owe to him our famous, what we're proud of, that our language is an Indo-European language. It's a construct he came up with. Now, if I'm going to turn to German, and there we have the complete translation of the Divan of Hafiz done by an Austrian diplomat, Josef von Hammer-Purgstall, in 1812. What stands out in Hammer's translations is his adhering closely to Hafiz's text, both in form and language, which is very difficult to do in his ghazals in German. And equally importantly, he provided citations and allusions to Greek and Latin, thanks to our last speaker for bringing it up, because that was the classical tradition that the readers at the time knew. So he tried to make it palpable. These translations and explanatory notes then introduced the famous Johann Wolfgang von Goethe to Hafiz's poetry. And he was so enthralled with what he read that he wrote his own divan, which he called the Westostliche Divan, the West-Eastern Divan. And it's a work of homage and not a translation. There are other examples of classical tradition, classical Persian tradition being taken up by European and American writers. And I need only mention Coleman Barks, his adaptations of Maulana's poetry that sell like hotcakes in the US. These forms of dissemination of knowledge about Persian literature have been responsible for making Persian literary works accessible to readers not familiar with Persian language. And they've paved the way for other venerable translations. Today's translators of Persian do not necessarily emerge from the ranks of diplomats and colonizers. We might think that's a good thing, but we also would neglect the vital link between knowledge and power that at a time before us, in an earlier times, was palpable to those who held positions of power. But a true measure of our scholarly success is not the number of Iranians who are involved in research, translation, and teaching of Persian literature, say. We must instead measure our success by how much interest we generate among those who are not familiar with Persian. Speaking to ourselves is not a measure of success. It's when we engage a broader audience and challenge ourselves to go beyond celebrating our culture, be it literature or anything else, that we will have laid the foundation for a bright future. And in my view, the future will have to push beyond the boundaries of our own disciplines constantly. In comparative literature, this would mean broadening the scope of world literature and introducing students to cultures beyond their knowledge. To give you a concrete example, this fall, a colleague and I are teaching a world literature course on the concept and circulation of classics, the classics of any literature. In my segment, the students will read small sections of the Shahnameh in translation, along with Homer's Odyssey, for instance, and epics from around the globe. This will also be challenged they will be challenged to find resonances of the Shahnameh in comics, in films, in other representations and paintings. My objective is to give the students an appreciation of how the Shahnameh continues to be engaged, adapted, and reworked, not just in the Persian world. In another course, the Humanities Core, which is the signature course for the humanities required of all honor students. So I come across a lot of Iranian engineers in that course. I teach a novel by Shahrnush Barsipur, Women Without Men, its adaptation into film by Shirin Neshat, and Marjan Satrapi's Persepolis. Some of the thousands or so students enrolled in that course have never, ever heard of Iran. It might shock us. Or they've never even come across an Iranian writer. Through these works, they are not simply getting a taste of Persian literature, but also learning, for instance, about the 1953 coup, CIA coup in Iran, the 1979 revolution. And having taught this curriculum for 2 years, I've been gratified by the level of curiosity among the students. This curiosity is the first step to a desire to learn more and perhaps become someday specialists in the field. So to conclude, in my career over the past 29 years, I've learned that to study and teach Persian literature in the framework of comparative literature requires openness to new theories, paradigms, and pedagogical approaches. As a comparatist, I have long ago internalized the necessity of casting aside the kind of cultural chauvinism that would prevent me from critical analysis of our own literature and culture. Innovation in my field, therefore, is inextricably interwoven with how we examine our literary cultural legacy in order to better appreciate and situate it in a global context. By virtue of the fact that my work is focused on modern Persian literature and women's literary production, I cannot escape the thorny and vexed aspects of Iranian culture. Against this backdrop, what innovation means to me is to probe not only what is exemplary, but also the disagreeable and the discordant in our literature and culture. Thank you.
And our last panelist, distinguished speaker, Professor Ali Hajimiri, Fellow of U.S. National Academy of Inventors, and selected world's top 35 inventors under 35.
Roz Bekhair. Good morning, everyone. I know I was told that not to speak. So, well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here among such a group of talented individuals. I'd like to, okay, so we got that up here. So I'd like to basically, it was interesting to see the previous speakers and previous panelists give their presentation. We had no knowledge of each other, what we presented. So it's going to be interesting to see what's common and what is not. So I made the title Imagination, Creativity, and Innovation. And first thing I'd like to think about is what is the difference? What are these words and what do they mean to us? So first thing is basically, if you think about it, imagination is really a flight of mind. I mean, you let your mind go and we let ourselves think about things that are not necessarily real or practical or anything. We just let it go. So that's the first step. Creativity, if you think about it, is a disciplined imagination. I mean, artists do it, engineers do it, a lot of places you see this thing. And if you think about it, it is really a way of guiding it to a certain level, to have a discipline to control and kind of guide it. And then, but if you think about innovation, you have to take one more step. You have to go a little bit farther than that. And it's a question of basically, it's useful creativity. I mean, and useful basically can mean different things in different contexts. So one of the comments I would like to make is that unpurposeful and undisciplined imagination doesn't always lead to useful innovations. And this is something we need to realize. And that would tie in to some of the suggestions or some of the, I guess, strategies. The suggestion was to come up with suggest some strategies for being more innovative. And I'll do that in a few minutes. So that would tie into it. But at the same time, you have to realize that the vast majority of novel ideas do not lead to useful things. So this is something we have to accept, that not everything new is good, not everything good is new. And this is something we need to realize when we embark on that. Now, this may sound very regressive at this point, so, but okay, so let's see where it takes us. So where do good ideas come from? So we have to think about that. And the best way to have a good idea, really, is to have a lot of ideas. I mean, I think this is, if I wanted to impart one thing on you, remembering from this, is this, that unless you can generate a lot of ideas, the chances of you coming up with a good one is not very high. I mean, you may get lucky. And the other thing is that, in the process, something else happens that's probably even more important than that. It's just not a statistical game of roulette and say, okay, well, am I going to hit the number or not? It's that in the process, the bits and pieces of those bad ideas can be joined together later and picked and to form a good idea. So sometimes you see an idea, you do something that doesn't work, you think about a way of doing things, and this is not necessarily a technical thing, even in real life. You try something, doesn't work, but you think about it and say, well, that part of it was interesting, maybe I can use that piece and combine it with another piece of a bad idea, and I'll combine them to make a good idea. Now, the other suggestion is that look for things, always have an eye for things and people that surprise you. And not necessarily in a pleasant way. That's important, because that's where knowledge comes from. That's where growth comes from. If we are always trying to repeat and reiterate and listen to the thing and to ourselves and the things that reaffirm our own biases, we are bound to be in a very limited bubble. And we have different bubbles depending on which tribes we come from and all those things. But we will remain in that bubble. We need to really think about it beyond that. And this is very important in innovation. The other thing that I think is very important is not knowing how to do it and not knowing that it can't be done. A lot of times, I mean, there are visionaries of the field, of the varying fields, and they tell you things cannot be done. Or this is the way to do it. That's not a blessing. It's a curse. We need to really think about what it takes to forget what you've learned. I'll use the Yoda's terminology, unlearn what you've learned. Now, the other thing that's extremely important in being innovative is the breadth of knowledge. Knowing about things that you have absolutely no idea about. Going and having the courage to learn things that are completely out of your comfort zone, not partially, completely. Getting exposure. And when you're doing it wholeheartedly, immersing yourself fully in it so that you can actually get a sense of how people who do that think and what does it feel to be in that domain. I think this one is important. It's kind of easy to say and hard to do, but I think those things lead to it. Find connections among seemingly unrelated things. Look for things that apparently have no connection to each other, but try to see what's the common theme among them. Can you see things? And I mean really have nothing to do with each other. This can be also defined as intelligence, or at least creativity. Find the ability to find connection among seemingly unrelated things. Well, that's an incomplete sentence. Novel ideas are rarely generated out of the blue. That's what I meant to write. The last one is important, especially if you have kids, but in general, have a lot of free time. Be bored. It's great to be bored. When my kids sometimes say, I'm bored. You know, they've learned the lesson. They won't say it anymore. I say, wonderful. Great. What's wrong with you? I said, well, a lot of things, but that's one thing. Anyway, so innovation killers. Now, there are innovation killers. There are things that kill innovation and creativity. And we need to be aware of them, mindful of those. Being always busy, which ties into being bored. Looking for the perfect solution from the beginning. Saying, no, this is not going to work. This is not going to work. This is not going to work. You have to allow yourself some time, and we'll get to strategy, some period of time over which you can actually say, you know what? I'm going to humor myself. I'm going to just let this go and see where it leads. Obviously being afraid to look bad in front of your peers, right? I mean, you have to have thick skin. If you want to change the world, you have to have thick skin. If you want to make an omelet, you will break eggs. There will be people who will get upset. Life is too short to worry about it. If you want to make a difference, go forward. Overanalysis. I mean, sometimes we just analyze something to death. And this is not necessarily just for technical things, a lot of things in life. Focusing on your own ideas only. This happens in a lot of people, not invented here. Sometimes they refer to it as NIH, not the National Institute of Health. National Institute of Health, they're not invented here. Anything that I didn't come up with can't be good. And the know-it-alls, people who know the answer to everything, you tell them everything, just immediately. So you're not going to go beyond that. Dominating personalities. You have to be careful if you have one not to dominate other people. You have to leave them room. And if you don't have one, you have to be able to stand up and say, look, this is the idea. Let's think it through. And the other thinking that if this could be done, someone else would have done it already. We do this all. Okay, so the thinking innovation process and just the creation process can be thought differently. There are different ways to think about it. And this is one way, again, more specifically about the way I think about it, at least a little bit closer to my field. It may be applicable to other fields, it may not be. I'm just going to share it with you. So there are two ways to think about it. There are two trees in my mind. And some of the people who work with me know about these two trees. From time to time, I go to the whiteboard and draw them over and over, and they have to listen through it multiple times and tolerate me. But anyway, so there's a top-down tree. You want something to happen. You want to make it something that does something. You want to create an organization that performs a certain thing. You're looking for a certain feature. You're trying to achieve something, right? You can break it down into smaller pieces. You can say, well, for me to make this device, I have to have these 5 pieces. Or for me to have this organization, this company, I need to have these functions. And these functions have sub-functions. And you break it down into this tree, right? It can be a technical thing. It can be a device. It can be an organization. It can be anything. And then there's a bottom-up tree. There is a phenomena. There's a skill. There's a technique. There's something you can, well, let's see if the animation writes. Oh, there's something you're trying to achieve. There's something you can do, not something you're trying to achieve. You have a tactic, you have a technique, you have a capability, you have a feature. You observe a physical phenomenon and say, look, hey, that's interesting. That's a bug. Say, well, why is it behaving the way it is? And you can ignore it, you can try to suppress it, or you can say, look, all these bugs that I've seen, all these things that didn't work, all the weird things that we saw along the way, those things that surprised us earlier on, what can I build with it? The story of the guy who takes a button and says, well, I'll take it to the tailor and say, well, make a suit for me, right? With this. So this is the thing. So there are all those things that you can grow up, bottom up. And then the innovation, really kind of a creativity process involves identifying multiple top-down trees and multiple bottom-up trees and identifying where the interconnects are. And the more of these trees that you have in your mind, the more you can find, say, okay, if I want to make this interesting thing, if I were to make this organization, it would be interesting because I can use that piece from here and that piece from that tree that could connect. And then you make these connections and you create paths. And each one of those paths from the top to bottom, a completed path, is a new innovation, if you will. So strategies. I mean, some of them tie into what we said, just like let me summarize them. Get bored. And please do not pick up your smartphone. This is the new addiction. I mean, I can see people kind of like, and I do it from time to time. I have to stop myself. I'm thinking here, so put it back. Do not do that if you want to be innovative. This is also interesting. This may be a little bit different from some of the things that were said, slightly different in one way or another. But is that avoid looking up the solution. Avoid the invention killer named Google. You go, first thing they do nowadays, the kids go, so if you ask them a question, let me Google it. No, you don't Google it. Think about it. Because, so what's the worst thing that's going to happen? If you try to come up with a solution, this is the next bullet really, yourself. The worst thing that's going to happen is that you're going to spend some time, you're going to come up with something that somebody else has already done. You're going to reinvent the wheel. Even if you do that, you know exactly how the wheel works. You know much better. You have a better appreciation of how you arrive at the wheel. That's the worst thing. And every so often, your wheel may look a little bit different from other people's wheels, right? So that's the way to think about it. Don't wait for the perfect solution, the perfect being the enemy of complete or achieved or doing anything. You have to let go of that picture perfect thing. The process of innovation is as messy, if not messier, than making as making sausages and laws and things of that sort. So again, cherish people and events and things that surprise you. Don't try to just talk to people that reaffirm you. Try to understand what surprises you. That's where, I mean, even from a mathematical perspective, the information theory perspective, that's where information is. I mean, mathematically, that's the definition of information, things that surprise you. Create as many solutions as possible. Generate many things. How do you do that? Look for interesting bits and pieces here and there. Anything that you see, say, oh, okay, that's interesting. It may have nothing to do with anything at this point, but it may have something to do with something 20 years down the road. Now, this is another interesting strategy. This is the so you need to have I think one thing that works, at least from our perspective, is this periodic transition between periods where you try to generate ideas without really much constraints. You say, okay, let me just generate a bunch of ideas. You can call it brainstorming, something like that. And then the time that you go back and analyze and evaluate and dissect them and say, okay, well, this one is really not good. This is not going to go anywhere. This has this interesting piece, but let's keep it here. This one is interesting, worth pursuing. So this alternate periods. But in the first period, allow people and yourself, for people working with you and yourself, to just go and expand. Don't be overcritical in the generation phase, and that's very important. You can be critical and it's important to be critical in this second phase, but in the first phase, don't be overcritical. So, now, in the spirit of having quotes and gimmicks, so I'm going to give you one here and a couple more. So this is what Oscar Wilde said. That actually is one of my favorite. He is my favorite writer. So the imagination imitates. It's the critical spirit that creates. That's important. I mean, it doesn't mean that if you go freewheeling, you end up with people who call me. I get like probably once every 2 or 3 weeks, I get a call along these lines that pick up the phone. Hello, you're such and such. Yes, I'm such and such. I am interested in a business proposition, to start a business proposition with you. Say, great. We have started this company to make a device that moves back and forth in time. Wonderful. How do you plan to do it? Say, that's where you come in. All right. So that the critical aspect of it is important. There's another quote that I'm going to give you here, which is basically this discussion of courage. And it reminded me of that quote. I was not planning to have it here, but I'm going to do it anyway. Is that the difference between, you know what the difference between courage and stupidity is? What is the difference between courage and stupidity? The end result. So, a lot of this has to do with luck. Now, if luck is involved in this, the only way you can win it's a statistical game. It's not chess. It's backgammon or poker or whatever you want to do. So you need to play a lot. You need to have a lot of ideas. You need to generate a lot and then be critical about it. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy the rest of the day.
So again, audience are welcome to ask questions if you want to. There are microphones at the aisles. So my first question is, after all these great presentations, let's opine on some of the ideas that your colleagues mentioned in the presentations. If you want to add any comments to the presentations you heard, any volunteer? Yeah, some of the, if you wanted to add anything to tell.
Maybe I'll start and then. So I agree with, everyone has their perspectives, and I agree with a lot of what was said. One thing I do want to emphasize, so there was talk of, not giving up. I think, it's like everything in life. You have to also know when to give up. Being pig-headed is not the whole thing. At some point you should make a decision that this is not the right route. I need to look, somewhere else. I need to change how I'm thinking, take a step back, things like that. The other thing I wanted to add was, I think there's a bit of humility that's necessary as well. At least that's what I have seen. So usually, again, this is personal experience. When I attempt to, in my mind, to solve some problem, usually I fail. It takes a few months to figure that out. And, if you don't fail first time, it typically means that this was low-hanging fruit to begin with, and perhaps not something, that needed that much innovation. And so I usually give up, and then I might return to the problem 2 years later, something like that. But then I approach it with lower expectations, knowing it's difficult. And then the second time you look at it, you say, well, actually, these partial ideas that I had in solutions are actually not that bad. And you often end up changing the problem. And so I think in innovation, that is a lot, and often we don't ask the right question. It's after we realize, the difficulty, the obstacles, it's illuminating. And so when I look at a lot of what I've done in my career, The breakthroughs have happened not so much because we came up with a solution, but we actually modified the problem. And I think that's, again, it's not a cop-out, but I see that as a pattern that happens quite often.
You have a question?
Mr. Parvarandeh has a comment. And after.
So, if I may, I'd like to add a perspective from the corporate side of things in terms of, what I've learned over the years. Many companies need innovation to create a distinction and to create a differentiating factor in order to be successful. And what I've learned is that the environment of the company, the environment and the top-down message that is sent by the management of the company can either kill innovation or it can enhance it. So we've talked about how to enhance innovation, but companies, in my experience, can also kill innovation very easily through the behaviors that they have and through the policies and other approaches that they have. So I think it's incumbent upon management within companies to understand what their culture looks like. Are they supportive of innovation or not? Are the policies that they're pursuing, are they innovation killers or are they promoters of innovation? So I think that's another discussion to be had, which is what not to do in corporate environments with regard to innovation. If you want to succeed as being an innovative company, there are do's and don'ts. And that's also very important to take into consideration.
I see some of the audience have questions. If you could kindly line up behind the microphones here so I can know the priorities. We have at two sides, that one and this one. But you can start with your question, but for future questions, you may just line up behind the microphones. You may start.
My question is to your first speaker. In your database, do you seek out the second or third generation Iranians, and do you find it that they are sometimes don't wish to become part of the tribe, and also because of the cultural and political pressure, some of them even deny wanting to be an Iranian or belonging to the tribe? So basically, there are two questions. First of all, do you seek them out, and do they wish to be belonging?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, our database is completely anonymous. So nobody really knows who's in the database other than a few people, and that's kind of kept secret. Our way of identifying Iranian Americans or people of Iranian descent, well, first of all, our definition of Iranian American is anybody who lives in America and whose name sounds Iranian. That's our definition. When we initially thought about how to go about doing this, we thought, well, maybe people will come forward and say, hey, I'm Iranian. I think that's wishful thinking. So we decided to use these algorithms to basically identify Iranian-sounding names and go through databases to identify who those people are. So in answer to your question, anybody who lives in the US whose name sounds Iranian is included. That includes first generation, second generation, third generation. And of course, as generations proceed, some of the first names change, right? And so it becomes more difficult to identify. And then there's another issue, which is certainly with the female population, if they adopt the last name of a non-Iranian husband, for example, that throws us off. With respect to the second question you have, which is, do people want to be identified as Iranian American? Again, we're not here to force them to do so. We've got a completely anonymous database. For those people who feel that there is a necessity or there's a value in what IACP is doing, that's number one. There's not everybody is going to agree with the mission of IACP. So there's a subset of people who might agree. There's an even smaller subset of people who might want to come forward and say, you know, include me in, right? So we're not here to force anybody. You either want to be or you don't want to be, and whatever you wish to do is great. And I can only speak about my own kids. My kids they have a strong sense of being Iranian American. I have friends whose kids are not that way, and that's fine. So it's not necessarily a good thing. I'm not promoting that we all belong to the same tribe. I'm just saying for those who want to belong to this tribe or who self-identify, let's give them the power to represent themselves better. That's all we're doing.
Yeah, again, if audience line up behind microphone, I know the order better. That lady actually was like, she had a question earlier.
To go first, but yeah.
Sure. And then you next.
Shall I go? Okay.
I'm going to piggyback on what Dr. Hassibi said. I was at an event and a Disney creator said in the process of innovation and creation, there's also the sad part of killing the darlings, is what he put it, that sometimes you get to a point that you have to kill the darling. And I want to ask any of the panelists if they have any experience of a time that they had to kill a darling, and how do you know when to stop or change path?
Maybe I can say, at least I can say I've been a mass murderer in that sense. But yeah, no, I mean, of course, you have to keep constantly do it. I mean, that's a pruning process of the tree, kind of like you just take it apart. And that's why it's so important to generate as many ideas as you can initially, so you can have more still to deal with.
Let me present a different perspective on it, because to me the kind of final outcome is not that important. So for that reason, I don't think anybody with passion will kill any project or solving any problem. The process itself and the journey is probably more important. Let me just give you one example. So when I was at Bell Labs, I was working at, I'm kind of a late person. So sometimes late at night, there were only a few people around. One of them was this great mathematician. I talked to him, said, what are you working on? And he told me I'm working on Riemann hypothesis. So those of you who know, Riemann had this hypothesis about 100 years ago, which I think still is an open problem. So he has been working on it for years, and I saw him actually a few years ago. I asked him, what are you working on? And he said, I'm working on the Riemann hypothesis. But throughout these years, he has created so much good mathematics, so I don't think he has failed. But probably he doesn't even care if he does what he does, because that's his interest, that's what he's doing. And at this point, I think most likely he's not going to solve Riemann hypothesis, but I don't call it a failure, and he has not given up. But if your goal is to solve that problem, yes, you should give up, but it's a different way of looking at what he has been doing.
Also, my perspective from my line of work, a lot of times we have physical explanation for the solutions we offer to the problems, which might sound very right, but we might fail because we don't have the right tools to approach the problem. So in these kinds of problems, we struggle for a while, and when we're convinced that now is not the right timing in terms of the available tools, we partially kill the problem for the moment, but we always have it on the side, and as technological breakthroughs come, we revisit a lot of problems. It happens a lot.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I think the perspectives we're hearing are kind of all complementary, and I think we're all saying the same thing. I don't think if people have passion about some big problem, I don't think they rarely kill that. It's approaches that they kill maybe temporarily to try something else. And so when I had mentioned it earlier, it was more in that spirit that, you know, maybe this line of attack is something we should give up. And it is true. It's like any other human endeavor. You know, one gets attached to things that you do, and so it's not it's easy to say, okay, let's try something else. It's sometimes not. I've had students where we worked on a problem for months, and then we have this long discussion. We realize this is not going anywhere, and so we decide not to do it. And the next week they come, they're still thinking about this approach. So it does require some effort. As I said, you know, all of this is a human endeavor, so it comes with all the baggage that we have as humans.
I have one question for Professor Rahimieh, and after that we answer one last question and we'll finish the panel. We talked about innovation, and Professor Rahimieh talked about innovation in humanity and literature. Professor Jarrahi mentioned that it's very important to ask the right question. My question is, what's the role of critical thinking and whether humanity and social sciences can help inventors to better think and better ask the right question?
Well, we always say, is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. In the humanities and social sciences, we say we are in the business of training minds and teaching students how to think critically. So never to take the status quo, never to take prefabricated ideas, sacrosanct ideas as the truth. And so indeed, what we're telling students is we probe their minds so that they can ask the questions that will generate the future ideas. And this is why, you know, it's not necessarily liked by some of our students coming from other schools, because we ask them over and over again to re-examine their own ideas, re-examine their own thinking. Why did you say this? How would you back it up? What is the evidence that you can use? So indeed, yeah, we really do provide a kind of foundation for critical thinking, and critical thinking really cuts across all fields.
Great. Thanks very much. We have one last question. That gentleman over there with the microphone. Apologize, that's the last question.
Thank you so much. So I thought maybe I should give up on my question because the speakers suggested to. I have two questions from the first speaker, and the first one was already almost
If you only
covered.
ask one question, we only have time for
Sure,
one
okay.
question.
So the second question
minute.
was that in their line of work, which was really amazing and great, are they considering digging into the contributions of the Iranian Americans to the Iranian society? Because we only heard about the contributions to the American society. There are the accusations that he mentioned also on the other side, like being spies or whatnot. I think showing not only the stars and the galaxy is also important on that side as well, and are they planning to do so? Thank you.
Great question, great question.
So let me make sure I understood your question, which is, are we showing the contributions of Iranians in Iran, or are we showing the contribution of Iranian Americans to Iran? Iranian Americans to Iran. I see. Yeah, I think that that is a very sensitive question. And the reason it's sensitive is because as soon as we open up a conversation about how the immigrant community here in America is helping the people in Iran, it raises all kinds of flags. And that's just by virtue of the environment that we live in. I was part of an organization that was trying to help or promote entrepreneurship in Iran. And you wouldn't believe the number of rules and regulations that exist from OFAC. And one of the most incredible things that I learned is that it's illegal for me as an American citizen to be a mentor to somebody in Iran. Okay? So by definition, I am not allowed by law to help the people in Iran. So therefore, I can't document it. and I won't. But having said that, despite that limitation, I think we have our hands full with regard to the current scope that we have outlined for this organization, which is really to look at what Iranian Americans are doing in America. In the long term, our vision is to identify contributors in other countries, so European, Iranian immigrants in Europe, and eventually to hopefully create a network of Iranians around the world, including in Iran, who can talk to one another. But that's a dream. That's far off. Right now, under the current conditions, we have limited our scope to where we are. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you very much, panelists and the audience. I apologize. There are some other audience had questions. We have other panels, and we can ask questions in the other panels. Again, for the next panel, if audience line up behind the microphone, I can better know the order. Thanks very much. That's the end of the first panel. We are going to have 15 minutes break. We'll be back at 11:35. Thank you.